"You're not on the list, sir." The young guard's voice carried across the quiet entrance like a stone skipping across still water, sharp and final, the kind of voice that had practiced authority but had not yet earned it. Corporal Ethan Briggs stood rigid at the black iron gate of Arlington Ridge Memorial Grounds, one gloved hand resting against the temporary barricade set up for the morning's ceremony. Behind him, rows of American flags moved slowly in the cold October wind, their edges whispering softly against one another beneath a gray sky that seemed to press low over the cemetery hills. Beyond the gate, several hundred guests had already taken their places near the white canopy where the flag-draped casket of General Henry Callaway rested in solemn silence. A line of black sedans idled along the curved drive, engines humming quietly, while military aides moved with practiced urgency. The funeral of a four-star general did not tolerate confusion at the entrance, and right now, standing alone on the wrong side of that gate, was confusion itself. The old man didn't argue. Thomas Reed stood a few feet from the barricade, his posture straight despite the years resting on his shoulders. His suit was dark but worn at the seams, the cuffs slightly frayed, the fabric carrying the faint stiffness of something rarely taken from a closet. His silver hair moved gently in the wind, and his pale blue eyes were fixed somewhere past the guards, toward the quiet rows of folding chairs and the flag waiting beside the casket. Corporal Briggs followed that gaze and frowned. "Sir," he repeated, this time slower, as if speaking to someone who simply didn't understand the rules. "This is a restricted ceremony. Invitation only." Beside him, Private Noah Keller shifted his stance, gravel crunching beneath polished boots. Keller looked younger, the kind of young that still believed rank and rules could explain every situation. He glanced at the old man, then toward the gathering crowd behind them, where several uniformed officers had begun to notice the delay. "You hear him, sir?" Keller added. "We need you to step away from the gate." Thomas Reed didn't move. For a moment the wind carried the distant sound of a bugle being tested somewhere inside the grounds, a single hollow note that drifted through the air and vanished. Reed seemed to listen to it. Then he spoke, his voice low, calm, and steady in a way that didn't quite match the frailty people expected from an 80-year-old man. "I'm here for Henry." The guards exchanged a look. Briggs let out a short breath that fogged in the cold air. "General Callaway," he corrected automatically, his tone tightening. "And like I said, sir, if you're not on the list, he asked me to come." Reed said it simply, without emphasis, as if the sentence explained everything. It did not. In fact, it seemed to irritate the guards even more. Briggs straightened his shoulders, the crease of his dress uniform pulling tight across his chest. "Sir, a lot of people are claiming connections this morning," he said, gesturing toward the long line of arriving vehicles. "The Secretary of Defense is arriving in 15 minutes. We cannot have people wandering in off the street." Reed's gaze drifted once more past the gate. From where he stood, he could see the folded triangle of the ceremonial flag resting atop the casket platform, waiting for the moment it would be presented. For just a second something passed through his eyes, something older than the wind and quieter than the cemetery itself. "I'm not wandering," he said. "I'm keeping a promise." The words hung there, strange and out of place in the disciplined morning air. Keller scoffed softly and looked toward his corporal. Briggs took a step closer to the barricade now, lowering his voice the way people did when patience began to thin. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to leave the entrance area." Behind them, more guests were turning their heads. The motorcade escort vehicles were beginning to line the driveway. The ceremony would begin soon, and still the old man did not move. The wind moved again through the rows of flags, a slow, restless sound that seemed to whisper across the hillside like distant conversation. Corporal Ethan Briggs shifted his weight, the gravel under his boots scraping sharply in the otherwise careful quiet of the entrance road. The ceremony was minutes from beginning now, and everything about the morning had been planned down to the second. Schedules had been printed, routes cleared, security checked and rechecked. Nothing was supposed to happen here at the gate except silent arrivals and quiet nods from men and women who understood the weight of the day. Yet the old man remained, exactly where he had been standing, as if time itself had simply stepped around him and moved on. Thomas Reed did not raise his voice or argue. He simply stood there with his hands resting loosely at his sides, the wind tugging gently at the worn edge of his coat sleeve. The calm in his posture was unsettling in a way neither guard could quite explain. Most people who were turned away from a restricted ceremony reacted quickly. Some protested. Some apologized and left. Some tried to explain who they knew or why they should be allowed through the gate. Reed did none of those things. His quiet patience seemed to stretch the moment longer than it should exist. Private Noah Keller finally cleared his throat and leaned slightly toward Briggs. "Corporal," he muttered under his breath. "The motorcade is going to start arriving any minute." Briggs nodded but kept his eyes on the old man. Something about Reed's expression bothered him. The man did not look lost. He did not look embarrassed. If anything, he looked as though he had been waiting a very long time and was perfectly willing to wait a little longer. Behind the gate, the cemetery grounds were beginning to fill with motion. Officers in dress uniforms moved between rows of chairs. A group of aides adjusted the placement of a folded American flag near the ceremony platform. Farther down the path, a military band stood ready, instruments held still in gloved hands, their polished brass reflecting the pale morning light. Everything about the scene carried the quiet gravity reserved for a farewell to someone whose life had shaped the nation's history. Reed watched it all without blinking. His pale blue eyes followed the slow movement of the honor guard forming beside the canopy. For a moment his gaze lingered on the flag resting atop the platform, its precise folds glowing red and white beneath the gray sky. Keller noticed where the old man was looking and shook his head impatiently. "Sir," he said again, louder this time, "this ceremony is not open to the public." Reed turned his head slightly, meeting the young soldier's eyes with a calm that was neither defensive nor apologetic. It was simply steady. "I know," he answered. The reply only deepened Keller's frustration. Briggs exhaled slowly through his nose and glanced toward the road behind them where more black vehicles had begun appearing between the rows of trees. The first members of the official escort were approaching, their headlights pale against the overcast morning. The corporal straightened his shoulders and stepped closer to the barricade, lowering his voice again, though there was more tension in it now. "Sir, if you remain here, you are going to interfere with the arrival of senior officials." Reed gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the statement rather than challenging it. Then his gaze drifted back toward the ceremony grounds once more. The distant sound of footsteps on gravel echoed faintly as officers took their places. Somewhere inside the canopy, a chaplain adjusted the pages of a prepared speech. Reed seemed to listen to all of it, absorbing the quiet rhythm of the morning the way someone listens to a familiar song. Keller folded his arms and looked away, convinced the situation was simply stubbornness from an old man who did not understand military protocol. But Briggs remained uneasy. The old man's stillness did not feel like confusion. It felt deliberate. And in the silent space between the wind and the approaching motorcade, the corporal began to realize that whatever promise Thomas Reed believed he was keeping, the man had absolutely no intention of walking away. Lieutenant Mason Hale arrived at the gate with the clipped stride of someone already irritated before he understood the situation. The polished bars on his shoulders caught the dull morning light as he stepped around Corporal Briggs and took in the scene with a quick, impatient glance. The lieutenant was young, barely into his 30s, the kind of officer whose uniform looked like it had never known a wrinkle and whose confidence filled every inch of the space around him. He looked first at the barricade, then at the old man standing calmly beyond it, and finally at the growing line of vehicles approaching through the trees behind them. "Why is the entrance stopped?" Hale asked, his tone already edged with annoyance. Briggs straightened immediately. "Sir, this gentleman is not on the invitation list. We have asked him several times to step away from the gate." Hale turned his attention to Thomas Reed then, studying him from head to toe with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick judgments. He saw the worn suit, the weathered face, the calm posture that refused to match the urgency of the morning. The lieutenant folded his arms slowly across his chest. "Sir," he said, not unkindly at first, "this is a private military ceremony." Reed met his gaze without hesitation. The wind shifted again, tugging gently at the thin silver hair above his collar. "I understand," he replied quietly. Hale waited, expecting more explanation, but none came. The silence stretched long enough to attract more attention from the arriving guests behind the barricade. Several officers had begun to glance toward the entrance, their conversations fading as they tried to understand the delay. Hale's patience began to thin. If you understand, he continued, his voice becoming firmer, then you also understand that you cannot remain here. Reed did not argue. He simply looked past the lieutenant once more, toward the quiet platform where the flag rested under the canopy. The distant hum of engines grew louder as another line of black vehicles rolled closer to the gate. Hale followed Reed's gaze briefly, then shook his head. Sir, whoever you are here to see, he said, this event is not open to walk-in guests. Reed spoke again, the same calm tone that seemed almost immune to the rising tension around him. I am not a guest. Hale raised an eyebrow slightly. Then what exactly are you? Reed did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the ceremony grounds as if measuring the distance between himself and the quiet place where the casket waited. Finally he said, a friend. The lieutenant let out a short breath that sounded suspiciously close to a laugh. General Calloway had many friends, he replied. Every one of them received an invitation. Keller shifted beside the barricade, clearly convinced the matter had already been settled. But Reed shook his head once, gently. Henry did not send me an invitation. The lieutenant's expression hardened the moment the first name left Reed's mouth. The casual familiarity struck him as disrespectful in a setting built entirely on rank and protocol. That is General Calloway to you, Hale said sharply. Reed's eyes finally moved from the ceremony grounds to the lieutenant's face. It was Henry to me, he answered. The quiet certainty in his voice irritated Hale far more than any raised argument would have. He stepped closer now, his boots crunching firmly on the gravel road. Listen carefully, he said, lowering his voice so only the three men at the gate could hear him. This ceremony begins in less than 10 minutes. The Secretary of Defense is arriving. Senior command staff are already inside. I do not have time to debate personal stories with someone who does not belong here. Reed remained perfectly still. The lieutenant gestured toward the road behind him where the motorcade escort vehicles had begun to slow as they approached the checkpoint. Sir, Hale said, his patience nearly gone. You need to leave the gate now. Reed looked once more at the rows of flags moving slowly across the hillside, and when he spoke again his voice carried the quiet weight of someone remembering something far older than the rules standing in front of him. I promised him, he said softly. I would be here when the last flag was folded. The lieutenant's jaw tightened the moment the words left Thomas Reed's mouth. For a brief second the wind carried nothing but the low hum of approaching engines and the restless whisper of flags moving across the hillside. Lieutenant Mason Hale stared at the old man as if trying to decide whether the statement was arrogance or confusion. A promise, he repeated slowly, the faintest edge of disbelief entering his voice. Sir, with all due respect, General Calloway commanded 3 divisions and advised 2 presidents. Hundreds of people could claim promises from him. Reed did not respond to the remark. His attention remained fixed on the ceremony grounds beyond the gate, where the honor guard had now taken their places in a perfect silent line beside the canopy. The distant movement of white gloves adjusting ceremonial rifles caught his eye for a moment. Keller shifted again beside the barricade, clearly growing impatient. Lieutenant, he said quietly, the escort vehicles are almost here. Hale nodded without looking away from Reed. The lieutenant had already made his decision about the situation. To him, the old man represented a problem that needed to be removed before the arrival of officials who outranked everyone present at the gate. Sir, Hale said again, his voice now carrying the firm tone of command. I am going to ask you one final time to step away from this entrance. Reed finally moved, though not in the way the lieutenant expected. His right hand lifted slowly toward the lapel of his coat as the wind tugged the fabric slightly open. Hale's eyes followed the movement automatically, ready to stop the old man if he attempted to cross the barricade. But Reed only touched a small object pinned to the inside edge of his jacket. It was easy to miss at first glance, a dull piece of metal no larger than a silver dollar. Time had worn the surface uneven and the edges were slightly bent, as though the object had been shaped by rough hands many years ago. It did not shine like an official medal. In fact, it looked almost ordinary, the kind of thing most people would overlook entirely. Hale leaned closer, curiosity replacing irritation for a brief moment. What is that? He asked. Reed glanced down at the small piece of metal and brushed it lightly with his fingertips, the way someone might touch a memory rather than an object. Something Henry gave me, he answered quietly. Keller gave a short laugh under his breath. Sir, that looks like scrap metal. Hale reached forward without thinking and flicked the edge of the pin lightly with one finger. The dull metal made a soft tapping sound against Reed's jacket. You expect us to believe the general personally gave you this? The lieutenant asked. The moment Hale's finger touched the metal, something subtle changed in Reed's expression. It was not anger, and it was not offense. It was something deeper, like the quiet shift of a long-buried memory rising to the surface. Reed gently moved the lieutenant's hand away from the pin, his voice calm but firm. Do not touch that. The words were not loud, but they carried enough weight to make Keller stop smiling. For a moment the four men at the gate stood completely still. Behind them the first escort vehicle slowed near the entrance road, its headlights glowing pale against the gray sky. The ceremony inside the grounds was moments from beginning. Hale stepped back slightly, more irritated now than before. Sir, he said, his patience nearly gone. You are standing at the entrance to a military funeral claiming personal friendship with a four-star general and presenting a piece of scrap metal as proof. You must understand how that sounds. Reed did not answer immediately. His eyes remained on the small pin for another second before he looked up again at the ceremony grounds. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet certainty of someone, remembering a moment that had never faded with time. It may look like scrap metal to you, he said, but that piece of metal was still warm when Henry handed it to me. For a moment the lieutenant said nothing. The wind moved across the cemetery again, brushing through the rows of flags and carrying the distant rumble of the approaching motorcade up the entrance road. Lieutenant Mason Hale stared at the small, dull piece of metal pinned to Thomas Reed's jacket, as if the object had suddenly become far more complicated than it had first appeared. Still warm, Hale repeated, the words sounding skeptical even to his own ears. Private Noah Keller shifted beside the barricade and shook his head quietly. Sir, the first vehicle is pulling up. Hale glanced briefly toward the road where a line of dark government sedans had begun slowing near the checkpoint, their escort motorcycles idling just beyond the turn. The ceremony schedule was tightening with every passing second. He turned back to Reed, irritation returning to his expression. Let me make something clear, he said, his voice steady but firm. You are not on the invitation roster. There is no record of your name in the security briefing. And yet you are standing here claiming a personal connection to a four-star general using a piece of metal that could have come from anywhere. Reed listened without reacting. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the pin again, not defensive, simply protective. You may not recognize it, he said quietly. Keller let out a short breath that sounded like a suppressed laugh. No offense, sir, the young soldier said, but it does not look like something a general would hand out. Hale reached forward again, this time not touching the pin, but studying it more closely. The surface was uneven and darkened by time, its edges slightly curved as if it had once been broken from something larger. No official stamp, no insignia, no ribbon, just a small battered fragment of metal that carried none of the polish expected from military decorations. If this is supposed to prove something, Hale said, I am afraid it does not. Reed's eyes moved from the lieutenant back toward the ceremony grounds beyond the gate. Inside the canopy the honor guard had begun adjusting their formation, their movements precise and quiet. The flag resting across the platform stirred slightly in the wind. Reed watched it with the still focus of someone remembering a moment no one else could see. Henry was younger then, he said calmly. None of the medals had been given yet. Keller frowned slightly. What does that even mean? Reed did not look at him. His voice remained steady, low enough that the words seemed to belong more to memory than to the conversation happening at the gate. It meant he was not a general that day. He was a captain. Hale crossed his arms again, clearly unconvinced. Captain Calloway served 40 years ago, he said. Thousands of soldiers crossed paths with him in those years. Reed nodded faintly. Yes, he said, but very few were standing beside him when the rotor blades stopped turning and the metal came down around us. The lieutenant's patience thinned further at the vague explanation. Sir, he said firmly, stories from decades ago do not override security protocol. Reed's gaze finally returned to the small metal fragment pinned to his jacket. The memory behind his eyes deepened slightly, as if the quiet road outside the cemetery had begun to dissolve into something much older. That piece, he said softly, was torn from the side of the aircraft when it hit the ground. Henry pressed it into my hand before the smoke even cleared. Keller opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated when he noticed something unusual. Reed was not speaking like a man telling a story to win an argument. He sounded like someone recalling a moment that had never truly ended. The motorcade engines grew louder now as the first escort vehicles approached the gate. Hale glanced over his shoulder, clearly aware that the delay was becoming visible to the arriving officials. He turned back toward Reed, ready to end the conversation once and for all. But the old man was still looking at the pin with the quiet certainty of someone holding the last surviving piece of a promise made long before anyone standing at that gate had ever worn a uniform. Thomas Reed's eyes remained on the small fragment of metal pinned to his jacket, and for a moment the quiet entrance road, the barricade, and the impatient lieutenant standing in front of him seemed to fade into something far away. The gray sky above Arlington Ridge dissolved in his memory into a sky that had once been bright and endless, the air thick with heat and dust instead of cold October wind. He was not an old man then. His hands had been steady and strong, gripping the metal frame of a helicopter that rattled like a living thing as it skimmed low above a narrow valley. The roar of rotor blades had filled the world with a deep mechanical thunder that shook the air itself. Inside the aircraft, Captain Henry Calloway had been leaning forward in his harness, scanning the ground below with the focused calm of an officer who carried responsibility for every man around him. The aircraft had not been a polished ceremonial machine like the ones used for demonstrations decades later. It had been a working transport, scarred by miles of hard service and painted in dull olive green that blended into the rugged terrain beneath them. Reed remembered the smell of engine oil and hot metal inside the vibrating cabin, remembered the way the sun flashed across the cockpit glass as the aircraft banked along the valley wall. Then the sound had changed. It had not been dramatic, not the kind of moment people expected in stories. It had simply been a sudden metallic crack somewhere along the side of the fuselage, followed by a deep, grinding vibration that traveled through the aircraft frame like a warning. Reed had seen Calloway turn his head toward the noise, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second as the pilot fought to steady the helicopter. The valley below had risen closer through the open side door, rocky ground rushing upward as the aircraft lost lift faster than anyone inside wanted to admit. When the helicopter finally struck the earth, it had not been a violent explosion of chaos like people imagined. It had been a brutal jolt that threw dust and fragments of metal into the air, while the rotor blades slowed with a long shuddering whine above them. For several seconds no one had spoken. Reed remembered the strange silence after the engine stopped, broken only by the ticking sound of cooling machinery and the distant wind moving across the valley floor. Captain Calloway had unfastened his harness first. His uniform had been streaked with dust, his face pale but determined as he reached down toward a jagged piece of metal torn from the side of the helicopter's outer panel. The fragment had been no larger than the palm of a hand, its edges rough where the aircraft skin had ripped away from the frame. Calloway had turned the metal over once in his fingers, studying it with a quiet expression that Reed would remember for the rest of his life. Then he had pressed the fragment firmly into Reed's hand. "Keep it," Calloway had said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion in his eyes. "One day we will laugh about this." Reed had closed his fingers around the warm metal then, feeling the heat still trapped in it from the engine and the sun. He had not known that decades later he would still carry that same piece of metal in the pocket of a worn suit jacket, or that the promise tied to it would lead him back to the gate of a military cemetery on a cold morning long after Captain Henry Calloway had become a name spoken with respect across the entire country. The memory faded slowly from Thomas Reed's eyes, the roar of long silent rotor blades dissolving back into the quiet gray morning at Arlington Ridge. The wind moved across the cemetery again, lifting the edges of the American flags and carrying the distant sound of engines as the first escort vehicles rolled closer to the entrance gate. Lieutenant Mason Hale had already turned his attention back to the approaching motorcade, clearly ready to end the conversation and remove the old man before the arriving officials saw the delay. But someone else had been watching the entire exchange. Standing about 20 yards behind the barricade, partially hidden among a small group of arriving officers, Captain Daniel Brooks had not taken his eyes off Thomas Reed since the moment the old man mentioned the name Henry. Brooks had served long enough to recognize something that the younger guards could not yet see. It was not the story Reed told or the piece of metal on his jacket that caught his attention. It was the stillness. Men who had lived through real war carried a particular kind of quiet. They did not argue loudly. They did not try to prove themselves. They simply stood their ground in a way that felt older than the moment around them. Brooks had seen that kind of silence before. It usually belonged to men whose past had been written in places far removed from ceremony and polished uniforms. He watched Reed now as the old man remained motionless beside the gate, eyes calmly following the distant platform where the ceremony would begin in just minutes. Brooks noticed the way Reed stood, shoulders relaxed but balanced, the way his gaze never wandered nervously like someone who felt out of place. Something about it felt wrong for the situation unfolding at the entrance. Brooks stepped away from the officers beside him and walked a few paces closer, careful not to interrupt the tense exchange happening at the barricade. From this angle, he could see the small fragment of metal pinned to Reed's jacket. It was dull and irregular, nothing like an official decoration, but the way the old man guarded it suggested it carried weight that no polished metal could match. Hale's voice drifted toward him again as the lieutenant spoke sharply to the guards, clearly preparing to remove Reed from the entrance before the motorcade stopped. Brooks felt a quiet unease settle in his chest. The name Thomas Reed stirred something faint in his memory. Not a personal memory, but something he had once heard during a briefing years earlier while stationed at the Pentagon. It had been a passing reference during a private conversation between senior officers, a story about a man General Calloway had never stopped mentioning whenever someone asked him about loyalty. Brooks could not remember the entire story, only that the name Reed had been spoken with unusual respect. The captain reached into his jacket and quietly pulled out his phone. He stepped farther away from the gate, turning his back to the approaching motorcade so no one would see the sudden tension on his face. His thumb moved quickly across the screen until he found a number that very few junior officers would dare call directly. Colonel Richard Vance had served for years as one of General Calloway's closest staff officers before the general retired from active command. If anyone alive would recognize the name Thomas Reed, it would be Vance. The phone rang once, then twice. Brooks glanced back toward the gate where Lieutenant Hale was now clearly losing patience with the silent old man standing at the barricade. By the time the line connected, the first government sedan had already begun slowing near the checkpoint. Brooks spoke quickly, keeping his voice low. "Colonel Vance, this is Captain Daniel Brooks at Arlington Ridge Memorial. I need to ask you something important." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Brooks looked again toward the old man standing alone at the gate and continued carefully. "Sir, do you happen to know someone named Thomas Reed?" Captain Daniel Brooks held the phone close to his ear while the wind brushed across the cemetery entrance, carrying the distant murmur of arriving vehicles and the faint metallic clink of ceremonial rifles being adjusted beneath the canopy. On the other end of the line, there was silence for a brief moment after he spoke the name. Then Colonel Richard Vance's voice returned, no longer casual, no longer relaxed. "Repeat that name," the colonel said slowly. Brooks glanced toward the gate again, where Lieutenant Mason Hale had stepped closer to Thomas Reed, his posture rigid with growing impatience. The first government sedan had rolled to a stop near the checkpoint, its engine idling quietly as a uniformed driver waited for the entrance to clear. Brooks lowered his voice further. "Thomas Reed, sir. Elderly man, late 80s, maybe, standing at the gate. He says he knew General Calloway when he was a captain." The silence on the line stretched longer this time, heavy in a way that made Brooks straighten instinctively. When Colonel Vance spoke again, the calm tone had vanished entirely. "Describe him." Brooks turned slightly, studying Reed with sharper attention now. "White hair, thin build, worn dark suit. He has a small piece of metal pinned inside his jacket. Looks like a fragment of aircraft panel." The colonel inhaled sharply. Brooks heard it clearly through the phone. "Listen to me very carefully, Captain," Vance said. "Is he still outside the gate?" Brooks felt a chill run across the back of his neck. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Hale is about to remove him." The colonel's response came immediately, firm and unmistakable. "Stop that from happening." Brooks blinked, surprised by the sudden urgency. "Sir." Vance's voice dropped lower, but the authority inside it grew even stronger. "If the man at that gate is Thomas Reed, you will not let anyone escort him away." Do you understand me? Brooks glanced again toward the barricade where Hale was already gesturing impatiently toward the road behind Reed. Colonel, the motorcade is arriving. Security protocol, Captain Brooks, Vance interrupted sharply. General Calloway would not be lying in that casket today if it were not for Thomas Reed. The words landed with a weight Brooks had not expected. For a moment, he could only watch the old man standing quietly at the gate while the wind stirred the flags across the cemetery hillside. Sir, Brooks said slowly, are you telling me that is the same Reed? On the other end of the line there was another pause, but this one felt different, almost reverent. Yes, Vance answered quietly. And if he made the trip to that funeral, then he belongs inside that gate more than half the people already sitting under that canopy. Brooks looked toward the ceremony grounds where rows of senior officers had begun taking their seats. A distant bugle tested a single note that echoed softly across the hill. Colonel, he asked, does anyone else here know that? Not yet, Vance replied, but someone very important will. Brooks frowned slightly. Sir, the colonel's voice carried a final command that left no room for doubt. Stay where you are, Captain. I am making another call. At the gate, Lieutenant Hale had already stepped forward, clearly ready to end the delay himself. The lieutenant reached toward the barricade as if preparing to order the guards to move Reed aside before the next sedan arrived. Brooks lowered the phone slowly, his eyes fixed on the quiet old man standing against the wind. Something much larger than a simple misunderstanding had just begun moving through the chain of command, and every instinct Brooks possessed told him the next few minutes were about to change everything. Lieutenant Mason Hale stepped forward at last, his patience fully exhausted as the second sedan in the motorcade slowed behind the first. The quiet delay at the gate had begun to draw attention from several arriving officers who now watched the scene with growing curiosity. Hale placed one hand on the barricade and gestured firmly toward the road behind Thomas Reed. Sir, he said with final authority, this conversation is over. You need to step away from the entrance immediately. The wind moved across the cemetery again, lifting the rows of flags into a soft, restless wave that rolled across the hillside. Reed did not move. His eyes remained on the distant platform beneath the canopy where the folded American flag rested beside the casket of the man he had once known simply as Henry. The engines of the escort vehicles idled quietly behind him. For a moment, the entire entrance road seemed suspended between motion and stillness. Hale took another step closer, preparing to order the guards to escort the old man aside before the next vehicle arrived. And then the sound of another engine cut through the morning air. It was louder than the others, deeper, the unmistakable tone of a larger government vehicle approaching quickly up the entrance road. Several heads turned at once as a black armored SUV moved past the line of waiting sedans and rolled directly toward the gate. The vehicle stopped sharply beside the barricade. Before anyone at the entrance could speak, the rear door opened and a tall uniformed figure stepped out into the cold wind. 4 silver stars caught the pale light on his shoulders. The reaction was immediate. Corporal Briggs straightened instinctively. Private Keller snapped to attention. Lieutenant Hale froze where he stood as recognition flashed across his face. General Robert Whitaker did not even glance at the guards. He moved past them with long, deliberate strides, his gaze fixed entirely on the elderly man standing quietly beside the barricade. The conversation at the gate stopped completely. Even the arriving officers several yards away fell silent as they watched the general approach. Reed turned slightly as Whitaker came to a stop directly in front of him. For a moment the two men simply looked at each other. The wind tugged softly at Reed's worn coat sleeve. Then General Whitaker raised his hand in a precise formal salute. The motion was sharp and unmistakable. The entire entrance fell silent. Lieutenant Hale stared in disbelief as the highest-ranking officer present held the salute in front of the old man he had been trying to remove only seconds earlier. Reed hesitated for a brief moment, as if the gesture belonged to another lifetime. Then he returned the salute slowly, his movements steady despite the years. Whitaker lowered his hand and spoke in a calm voice that carried clearly across the quiet entrance road. Mr. Reed, he said. General Calloway made one request before he passed away. Reed watched him quietly. Whitaker continued, his tone firm but respectful. He said that if Thomas Reed ever came to his funeral, no one was to leave him standing outside the gate. The words settled. over the gathered officers like a sudden stillness. Whitaker stepped aside and gestured toward the cemetery grounds behind him. "You belong inside, sir." Reed glanced once more toward the canopy where the ceremony was about to begin. Then he walked forward through the gate as the rows of soldiers standing nearby instinctively straightened into silent respect. Behind him, Lieutenant Hale remained motionless beside the barricade, staring at the worn piece of metal pinned to Reed's jacket and realizing that sometimes the quietest men carried the longest promises.